these days, and others do the heavy lifting. But today, what I wanted to go into was a couple of the things that we have run into at client sites involving the use of the GIST ID class and the properties that are associated with it, because it's a nice pattern for dealing with data that can be very powerful and very useful, and just wanted to make people aware of it. So let me get my screen share started here. And okay, so using the GIST ID class, it is very much the case, that in the real world, you will have multiple identifiers for, one thing, for, what the technical term being the referent. And among the more common places where you will see this will be identifiers for people who can have tax IDs, driver's licenses, email addresses, any number of kinds of IDs will be associated with persons. Organizations, they can, in addition to any internal IDs, there can be industry IDs or stock ticker symbols. And then with assets, things that you own or that your firm owns, stock numbers, universal product codes, a great number of things may pop up and be used as identifiers. And one place where we saw this was at one of our clients. The systems that we would be bringing data into our knowledge graph from would typically identify personnel using their user ID, their badge ID, their email address, or just their name. And so, as a string, and then even then the name, sometimes it would be first name, sometimes last name, comma, first name. You just never know what you are going to get. And none of these IDs were guaranteed to be unique or permanent. If somebody left the firm and came back in, they probably were going to get a different badge ID. They were very likely to get a different email ID. So you could not be sure that any of these things are going to be permanent. And so our personnel IRIs, we did find one ID that was guaranteed to be unique and permanent. So when a person left and came back, they would still get this one particular identifier. So we built our IRIs on that, but almost no system ever used that particular ID. So we think that that's a pretty common occurrence, that with your own enterprise, you are almost certainly going to have multiple systems, having multiple IDs, all pointing back to the same thing in the real world or in the virtual world. And they will, as I said, they'll have different IDs, and you can pick one of these, or you might pick one of these IDs as the basis for your IRI, what we call the suffix on the IRI, or you may have your own thing to generate your IRIs independent of any of those existing IDs. That's another way to go. But what do you do with all of these other relevant identifiers that are likely to be flowing around through these various systems? So one idea, one approach. Yes. And
can I get in for a quick second?
Sure.
Are you going to deal with the sort of knee-jerk RDF OWL thing to do is to create all of those other things as URIs and do same? Are you going to get to why not to do that? Or
the very next slide.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's all right. At least I'm my flow of thought is a little validated now, since you were thinking the exact same thing. So one approach could be to create an IRI for each one of those you know, based on the different IDs, and each of them belong, you know, in this case, you know, being a person, you know, the reference being the same person, and then doing an OWL same as on, you know, on all of those. And technically, this works, but it requires the reasoner to always be on, and it really runs against the principle of trying not to have multiple IRIs on the same thing. You know, in the course of dealing with real world stuff, and particularly in some of the things I will bring up here shortly, you know, sometimes it's unavoidable. You will have multiple IRIs for the same referent, and then the OWL same as may be a good way to go. But in this case, we think that's a bad idea because you do have to have the reasoner on. You're relying on the reasoner, and this can have, you know, negative performance impacts. So this is not the way we would counsel. Instead, what we recommend is that you create your canonical IRI, typically using one of the identifiers that you have available to you. It is best, in our opinion, to use an identifier that is under your control, meaning, you know, like somebody's driver's license number is not under your control, you know, whereas something that's generated by an internal system is under your control. And so it's probably a little better to rely on that for your canonical IRI for the referent. And then create a bunch of GIST ID instances using those other identifiers, and then associate those GIST ID instances with the thing that you want to identify. So before we delve into that, you know, at this point, I want to kind of look at the GIST ID class. We treat the ID as a subclass of content because, in a way, that's really what it is. It's just some piece of content that was allocated by or created by some organization or person, or intellectual property, which I'm not going to get into the rationale for that particular part of the clause, and then some unique text associated with that ID. And you know, we note that we have some other annotations over here, you know, but that it is content that is used to uniquely identify something or someone. And one key thing to remember when dealing with GIST IDs is that the ID instance is not the same as the thing identified. You know, as in, you are not your driver's license. You have two different things. The driver's license number may refer back to you. It may identify you, but it is not you. So always bear in mind when you are using GIST IDs in your data, not to confuse the ID with the identified thing. We've got two properties that are specifically for use with the ID class, identified by and identifies. And you know, we've got the functional or inverse functional property applied to these, which means, you know, in the case of you know, identified by, that you know, a person is identified by uniquely, you know, this one ID. I note down here in the lower right that we do not have a domain on either of these properties, or a domain on identified by or a range on identifies, because anything can have some identifier associated with it. So it's entirely open-ended there. Any questions on either the class or the property before we move on?
Yeah,
Oh.
I raised my hand, but I hope it's fine since you asked. Why are these things both inverse functional? Shouldn't one be functional and the other one be inversely functional?
In fact, I just raised that question with our team internally the other day.
That's a change I've made in our use of
Yeah.
gist, because I think that's just wrong as it is. But
yeah, it is a thing, and it's only when I was putting this together did I notice, like, oops, so yes, I believe the identifies needs to be made to be functional.
Cool. And is unique text, I forget if unique text is functional as well or inversely functional. It's one of those perhaps, but one thing that one thing that I've ran into here, right, is and you might talk about this some more. So we have the identifiers, but then we have the data type properties that are you can either use in lieu of the IDs, right? Because you could go straight from an individual person to their social security number, right, rather than going through this intermediate ID. Or once we have the ID, I might be tempted to make a sub property of unique text that's like SSN text or whatever, right? And that can run into some problems too. So
yeah. So let me go on to the next thing, which I think addresses part of what you were saying, and then we can also get into some of the other questions you were raising here.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
Can I throw in one other issue, which isn't really about properties, but about classes?
Sure.
It's always bothered me that ID is a subclass of content, but its most frequent form is textual, and I'm pretty sure content can be multimedia. So I can perfectly understand a graphic being an identifier, like a trademark. It's an obvious example. You could even go so far as to say, the trademark symbols that are displayed at the beginning of a movie that identify studios are identifiers of those studios. So I think there's a valid case for saying that an ID can be multimedia and therefore, subclass of content. But
Right.
I would suggest that the most common use that we all make of GIST ID is textual IDs. So I actually think for correctness, it might be better to have a class which is the intersection of ID and text, call it text ID, so that we can prohibit the possibility that the ID we're talking about is multimedia. Because in fact, in our triple stores, our IDs are text.
Okay. So okay. I don't think we have time to unravel that one today, but as a discussion for the GIST issues group, I think that might be something we need to take up.
Sure. Okay.
So hearkening back to the slide earlier where we had these various IDs that were associated with a person, and our recommendation that you create several IDs using those identifiers. And so in this case, what we have here is we've got our person with their canonical IRI, and then we have your three different identifiers, and the person is identified by those identifiers. Each of those identifiers has a unique text property coming off of it where we capture the information as a string. And then we also typically put a category on the identifier to clarify what kind of ID it is. And so this goes to the question earlier about the point you could just have unique text coming directly off the person, coming off of person 784, 725, you could have unique text T167, unique text 135, unique text MARI TJ. But there are issues with that, in that if you wanted to query later, and you wanted you needed to be finding driver's license numbers, now you have no way of knowing which of those identifiers are driver's license numbers. All you've got is just a person and some identifier strings, and you have no knowledge of what they mean. You have lost the meaning, the semantics behind the identifier. So that's one reason why we highly recommend creating these, semantic instances for the IDs, so you can know things about them. Because you could also have, when was an ID given? When did it expire? Who gave it? Be it a system or a person. All sorts of other information are available when you create IDs as instances instead of just a string. So does that kind of address the point that I don't know who brought that up?
I think you're referring to my question. This is Casey. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right, very good. It does not necessarily address the question of SSN text being a subclass of unique text, except, well, actually, so let me back up. So to address the loss of the information, that I was saying, when you do go straight to the text, if you create a bunch of sub properties under there, that is one way of handling that. But again, now you're having to add a new property every time you come in with some new kind of identifier, and somebody has to know which identifiers are available. Whereas by relying on the more generic, identified by, unique text, and grabbing these IDs, and then once you grab the IDs, then you can look at the additional information that you have about them, what kinds they are, as well as what's the string, and the other provenance information around that. You do still have to add a new category instance for each new type of identifier you want to add in, but that is less of a cognitive speed bump, and less likely to affect Sparkle queries and such than the addition of a category, than would the addition of a sub property of unique text. So this is the pattern that we strongly recommend. And in a moment you'll get to see again some of the rationales for why that works well.
Hey Dan, we've got 5 hands raised, and we are
okay.
in this order. It's Ted, Michael Sullivan, Michael Ushold, Boris, and myself.
All right.
So Ted.
You can drop my hand. Let's see, I can do that.
Okay.
Oh, there,
Michael
I lowered
Sullivan.
my hand.
Michael Sullivan.
Just presumably if the 784.725 ID is an internal ID, you would have a in between just ID because there's no way to search for that right now.
Yeah. Yes, I left that out just for reasons of space, but yes, I do recommend creating an ID instance for whatever your whatever the basis of your IRI is as well.
And presumably, given that category is one of those things that is used quite a bit, presumably you would have a subcategory called ID type. So
yes.
So therefore, that would be technically not a best practice to throw everything into the GIS category bucket.
Oh yes, bucket. Yes, yeah. Sorry, that was an unspoken assumption on my part. Yeah, there quite a number of subcategories of or subclasses of category, that are semantically named around the things that they are identifying, or tagging, type of tags.
Michael Ushel. Oh, did you just drop your hand?
I did. But my comment became invalid just now.
Okay. Boris.
Are you muted?
You muted? Yep.
Yes, I was. So I was talking more about the wanted to mention, I mentioned this in chat as far as the minting of the URIs itself, because of the, I know we usually use the class name as the infix in URIs as the sample IDs over here. But the problem is IDs can come from different sources, and therefore you have a problem of collisions. So
yes. So yeah. So to clarify, what Boris is saying is, in this middle column here with the ID instances, if you've got enough sources going on, you could wind up with some other ID that was, T167000185. So in practice, what we really typically do is, instead of just having ID as our midfix, we get a little more specific about, the source or the kind of ID it is, which, on a first glance, you go, oh, well, doesn't that make the category, superfluous? Well, no, because you still want to be able to do a nice, easy sparkle search on, particular types, and you don't want to be parsing the IRIs to get what something is.
yeah, the IRI
yes.
should only provide uniqueness. It shouldn't carry meaning within the IRI at all.
Right. But by getting a little more specific in our midfix, we prevent collisions. So it's got a twofold bonus there.
Yep. So we got, to me, if anybody's taking notes, actually Casey noted, we have unique text as functional, and the intent there is two IDs with the same unique text will be assumed to be same as the same ID. But of course, the problem is if you accidentally got the same piece of text in two different ID subdomains, if somebody assigned the same telephone number as a social security number or something like that, and they were using both of them for identifiers, that would create a problem. So I think we had to put a request in there to take that off, maybe put it in what the intent was originally was that it would be unique within any little subdomain, like social security numbers should be unique and employee ID should be unique, but not unique across, but that it's global. So I think we have to do that.
Dave,
Yes.
we talked to that issue came up in the recent discussions. I think it's correct as it is. The unique text says an individual ID can only have one text. You can't have your driver's license be two different texts. This other question about the same text being used in multiple IDs is handled by the inverse functional of identifies by. So I think it's correct.
I have to run through an example. I think it might not, but yeah. Okay. And Rebecca.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that in some contexts, at least, it's appropriate, instead of using categories for different types of IDs, to use subclasses. And that way, if you want to say something about the class of IDs, such as social security numbers are issued by the U.S. Social Security Administration, or have this format or something like that, which often you may want to do, then you would have classes rather than categories, and that would also address the infix issue, because the infix would be the subclass name.
Or you might also have subclasses of IDs and categories within those subclasses. But thank you. That is a very good point. That's you have to assess your own datascape and decide whether which of those routes is most appropriate.
Okay, and Michael Sullivan, is a new hand or is that your old hand? I'm gonna go on to Casey. Casey Hart.
Yeah, so just
old hand.
So yeah, my quick thought is one temptation when you see unique text. This is something I fell into when I used GIST, right? Is to say, well, there's a more general data type property, which is text, right? And so this should be a subproperty of text, and that's fine. But then I also want to say, well, here are some more specific types of unique text. It's like the social security number text or whatever. And then I would put that underneath as a subproperty of just unique text. And then that runs into problems because just dealing with functional sort of stuff, right? So I have put in the chat, I'm just saying this is something that might be useful to people. I have another property, which is like identifying text, which is not inversely functional. And then unique text, but every subproperty of identifying text is inversely functional, unique text being one of those. And this keeps me from running into as many problems where I have multiple texts that are supposed to be unique showing up. But it also handles the thing that you were talking about earlier, Dan, which is there's a general property that I can look for, which just find all the identifying text. So you don't need to be privy to know, or like an expert in the ontology structure to know what all of these subproperties are in order to ask a more general query, right?
Right. Okay. And in at least one instance, I have done a similar thing where I had we created an ID text data type property that was not functional, just in order to avoid the potential collisions. So. So nice to know. Again, to have that choice validated is gratifying. Okay, any other hands? All right. So now, positing that we have these IDs associated with various things. Let's look at an example in one of our client situations where this came in rather handy. So at this client, we have a thing called the software agent, which was essentially my semantic attempt to avoid using the word application or system. But basically, it was dealing with software because that was what our immediate client was needed to know about. So we had these software instances, and they were being minted from this particular system, System X. And over time, these triples about the software agent started being used in multiple knowledge graphs by different user communities within that same client. As they all began building their own ontologies and everything. This is one of those nice, really reusable pieces of data that built up a pretty large user community. And the IRIs for these are all based on this system identifier, but we've got this ID on it as well. So this 13579, we used it in our IRI, but we also have this ID of 13579, and it's an ID type asset inventory. So, all well and good. Everybody's, running along fine with that. But now we have another group within that same firm who are dealing with a slightly different context. And so they need to bring in data from System X that's beyond just the software agent. There are other things in there that technology assets that they need to semantify the data for. They need to use that same identifier, system identifier, as the basis for their IRIs, but they don't necessarily want to. They need a broader class of things, and so following our minting pattern, they would have these instances of technology asset 13579. If I were to paste in, a little thing from Protege, the class hierarchy would be that we have, things that are ownables, and then assets, and then technology assets, and then software agents. So subclassing down that way. So there are reasons why we need these separate IRI mintings, which I'm not going to go into here, but there was the question of what do we do? Are we creating problems? Are there going to be collisions? Is this going to be an issue? And it turns out not really, because we can associate that identifier, that ID instance, with this newly minted technology asset. And so, by using that common ID and this identified by property, the reasoner can infer that in this case, these two things are the same. Or alternatively, we can just go ahead and assert that these two things are the same, or maybe if you don't want to do an L same as, you could do a SCOS exact match assertion. And the nice thing about this is that with some of the visualization tools and some of the query tools, you get into this oddness of some of the platforms, the reasoner only runs on when there's a query performed. But sometimes on your visualization, where you're just looking at the node edge node stuff, that's not coming from a direct query. Maybe it's been part of a follow your nose sort of thing. And so you may not necessarily have the inferences available. And so you want to have the asserted relationship, that asserted match, always present. So a couple of different ways that you can go there, but this is all predicated on having these IDs available that you can match on and make the case that these two things are the same. Any questions on this before I move on to the next thing? Okay. So we do want to talk about.
I do have a question. I was on mute. Oh, just lost it. Oh, I know. The allocated by, when you have subclasses of ID, each ID, like driver's license or SSN, can have its own allocated by. Social security numbers are allocated by some U.S. governmental, the state usually issues driver's license IDs. But you lose that if you don't have subclasses of just ID. If you're just identifying them by types, by instances of ID type, you lose the information about allocated by.
It's allocated by on the instance or on the class? Because
well, it's on each instance. It's on each. The way it's a has value restriction. It's a clever trick. You'd have to have inference to tell which things are allocated by what.
Actually, that was my earlier point, right? That you would use subclasses instead of categories to make additional statements about the identifier, not only allocated by, but where it's valid in, what the pattern is, etc.
It's not doesn't mean what you're doing incorrect. It's probably a great idea, yeah. But it does limit you from saying anything about who's allocating it.
It depends on the context of what you need to say.
Yeah.
So we have two more hands up. Michael Sullivan and then Casey. Michael?
I'm sorry, my hand. I guess I have to hit it to turn it off.
Yeah, you have to high five yourself. Yep.
Same error here. I apologize.
There we go.
All right.
Sorry.
And Ted?
I don't want to start a deep philosophical debate, but can somebody tell me the difference between SCOS exact match and OWL same as?
SCOS exact match is I think there's no entailment.
Yeah, one is formal, the other is informal.
Okay. That's enough for now. Yeah.
Exact match doesn't mean they're actually the same entity. It means they're semantically very close. But all same as means that every statement you make about one is also true of the other, which is not true for exact match.
Okay, yeah. So the exact and exact match is a bit of a misnomer.
Well, it's an exact match in it's
exactly.
Like it's roughly the meaning of synonym, maybe stronger, but it doesn't say that the two things are identical.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
There's still two things.
Coming out of SCOS, you know, that I think there's inherent fuzziness built in.
Yes.
So even on exact match.
Okay. Thank you.
So I do want to talk about when something is not an ID, or not a good candidate to be a GIST ID instance, and in particular, this applies with data sources that are not under your control. So external data sources, may have established IRIs, not just identifiers, but actual IRIs for their entities. And so the two examples that I'm putting out here are geonames and perm IDs. Geonames is put out by the geonames.org organization. Perm IDs are maintained by a company called Refinitiv, which was bought by the London Stock Exchange Group earlier this year. And but the things within within their data sets have actual IRIs, not just an identifier. And I'm making a big point of that because it's going to be important in just a little bit. And these IRIs incorporate their namespaces, their domain names. You cannot exercise any sort of governance over those IRIs. You can't change them. Things like that are just kind of verboten. And so, because these IRIs are referring to something, we almost certainly want to treat them as something other than a GIST ID. And also, if you are bringing in the supporting ontology behind these data instances, external data instances, they may have their own class associations as well. And so you don't want to possibly run afoul of some logical errors there, because in GIST we do have a number of disjoint statements. And so if you said something, this geonames thing was both an ID and a geo point, you're going to get a logical error. So you need to exercise caution when you're bringing these things in. But even when you're bringing in this external IDs, your internal IDs may still prove to be useful. And we saw this recently where in our internal data, or the client's internal data, they had parties associated with accounts. Some of these parties are organizations, and some of those organizations have legal entity identifiers associated with them. Now, the legal entity identifier is something that is created and maintained by an organization who I should have put in here in this slide, but it's gone off the top of my head. But there's an independent organization that mints these identifiers, but they have not gone the extra step and created IRIs using thetheir domain name to say, this IRI identifies this legal entity. All they've done is associated a particular string with with the name of some legal entity. So in this case, our client was on solid ground to create an ID instance using the legal entity identifier as its basis. So there was no real squatting going on there in the use of that. So then the client wanted to bring in the perm IDs data in order to supplement things we would know about various organizations and people out in the world. And so we brought that in, and we noticed that among the triples that the perm IDs data had was this TR.org has LEI thing. So it's like, let's check. We checked the documentation, made sure that has LEI was in fact referring to these legal entity identifiers from this third party. That was the case, so we were on solid ground, and so then we were able to, explicitly assert that the perm ID, the organization being referred to by that particular perm ID IRI was the same as this party in the client's data. So so now we get some, we have some clearly strong ties. So when we're doing querying, we can pick up extra information about these parties that the perm IDs provide. Any questions around that?
Yeah. Is there a goal to clean this up in the sense that, because it's repetitive, it's two different styles of recording information, and you have an all same as that can slow things down. It's a great thing to do in the short term, but I'm wondering if they're intending to do this long term for good reasons.
Well, when you say clean up the information, meaning what?
Well, there's two different ways of representing the exact same information, and normally that's not a great idea, because now you have two different routes of getting the same information. In other words,
you need talking about. Well, remember the perm ID stuff is, an external data source that we're using to supplement.
Okay. Oh, that's true. Of course, you can't
Yeah.
change that. Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you. All right, let's move on. There's only a few minutes left. Thanks.
Yep. So, in conclusion, the main thing is don't ignore the identifiers that you run across. Just because you're not going to include them in an IRI of your own making or something, don't throw them away. Create GIST ID instances for them, and that includes the ones you do incorporate into your IRIs. Create GIST ID instances so you have the strings that you can search on, and other metadata you can pile on to the ID instances, and then you will almost certainly be using these IDs to identify connections with other objects in your knowledge graph, which harkens back to the original thing I brought up of the 4 different ways that personnel were being identified in the various systems we were running across. And so being able to say, okay, system Y is using the user ID, and we've got a match for that, and we can get back to the person who's actually indicated there. So that's my presentation for today. Happy to entertain any other questions or discussions.
We got 2 more, Ted and then Booman.
I'm sorry, my hand should have been down.
Okay. Booman and then Michael Eschel.
Yes, is there the process, is it manual, both the mapping of the IRI to our unique IDs?
So usually what happens is the if you need a golden source for for some of these things, so like a golden source with the personnel that would also provide these other IDs, or at least match up on on some of the IDs. And then when you are bringing in other data sources, you can use Sparkle or Tarkle or, sometimes programmatic languages to do the matching for you. But recognizing what has to match with what, that is something that the person dealing with the data and the ontology has to deal with. There are automated tools out there that could do it, but they're expensive, and the learning curves and everything. Generally speaking, it's pretty fast to do the matching.
Okay.
Great. And Michael? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
So I've struggled with this over the years in terms of what option is the best option for my problem at hand. When we did work with one client some years ago, they didn't like this ID stuff. They just really wanted to have data type properties. So they wanted to say has LEI text string, has SSN text string. And that's the simplest, most direct, easiest to understand, and most efficient because you don't have to go that extra hop. So you didn't really focus on that as an option. You kind of mentioned it in passing. The thing you focused on as the recommended way to do it is an in-between place where you have just a single class for ID, and you don't create subclasses of ID. You capture the kind of ID as an instance of an ID type class, which is a great idea. But there is that third option, which is subclasses of IDs, SSN, driver's license, So have you come up with any guidelines for when to choose which? Because that's really an important consideration, or seem to be going with the middle one across the board.
Okay. So I did not go into the subclassing of IDs in the presentation, just for a matter of time, because we're already, we got like 2 minutes. And so but knowing when you want to subclass an ID specifically is very context dependent, I believe. So I was just kind of leaving it here for, we just treat it as IDs and for purposes of discussion. But I've strongly try and avoid using the subclassing of the unique text or whatever for the IDs, and relying on data properties for the IDs, because this is essentially it harkens back to one of the things of you have to know all the columns in a relational table in order to be able to access the things in those columns. There's a human knowledge involved there, and whereas we always make the point that with a well-made ontology, you don't have to have that knowledge, the way these things should snap together, and then you can discover additional facts about those things. And I think this pattern that we're using here of having the ID instances and categorizing them, gives you the precision that you want in terms of what kind of identifier is this, but without the cognitive load of knowing which one of these IDs do I want, or the other thing is, even if you are querying on the super property, that all your specific ID things are below, you won't know when you get the results back which kind of property these things, or which kind of ID these things were. So I think the pattern that I'm advocating here gives you the optimum way to go. Anyone else? All right, we are on the hour. Thank you all so much for coming in and attending, and we will have these slides out and available later.
Good presentation. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks for
Thank you.
having me. Thank you.